Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Los Banos Talk. My name is Justin Collins. Tonight's episode, I'm going to be looking at the recently published Los Banos Police Department's official crime statistics for the year 2020. You're not going to want to miss this episode because I talk about a very popular hypothesis that a lot of people have, which is many people believe that the crime increase over time is due to new people moving into town. This is a commonly held belief. And so I put this theory to the test. I took crime statistics data from our city from official sources, which I'll show you. I took statistics based on housing permits issued, based on population growth. I also broke it down by specific crimes, and then I compared it to the national average in other cities. You're really going to like this. I really dive into it, and the results were really surprising. And I was actually surprised to find what I did. And we're going to get into all of that in just a moment, right after a brief message from our sponsor. And we're back. Thanks for watching. So, as many of you are already probably aware, the Los Banos Police Department has published its annual crime statistics report, and you can find it on their Facebook page, like I did. And it's a PDF file that you can download and look at. And I'm going to show it to you here. And you can find it here. So, it's on the city website, and there's a link that they posted on their Facebook page. And here they give a message from the police chief where he talks about the acknowledgement of the spike in crime. Now, the statistics that I'm going to focus on today are here, the crime statistics. There were some issues with this table that I didn't like, and so I took this data and copied it into a new table into Excel, or actually Numbers, the Apple version. And so there's a couple things I'll show you and I want to talk about. One of the first things, though, that I want to go over is this, the homicide rate. You're going to notice that the homicide rate increased dramatically, right? Actually, this number is still not correct. It actually should be 450%, because to go from 2 to 9 is a 4.5 times increase. 4.5 times 2 is 9. So 450% increase, not 350% increase. A 350% increase would be 2 to 7. So it's actually 450%. But regardless, what is really important is that understand this. Sometimes statistics can be a little misleading, right? 450% increase sounds crazy dramatic. And that's true, because what does that convey? That means that it went up by 4.5 times, which it did. Four and a half, 4.5 times 2 equals 9. Ergo, 450%. So there's a few things about statistics that can be a little misleading to people if you haven't really studied much about statistics or if you're not really a numbers guy. So let me kind of explain some things. So, like I said, 4.5 times 2 gives you 9. So the lower the number you start with, the easier it is to have a really high percentage increase difference. So for instance, if you were in a big city, right, and there was 100 homicides a year, and then this year you got 40 more homicides, that would be a 40% increase. But because we start out with 2, going from 2 to 9, which means 7 more homicides, 7, that 7 gives us a number of 450% increase, which again can kind of seem misleading because the reason is because we start from such a low number to begin with. Technically speaking, from 2018 to 2019, going from 1 to 2 is a 100% increase. So to give you an idea, there was a 100% increase in homicide from 2018 to 2019. But the reality is that there was only one more homicide than there was the previous year. So that can be very misleading. When you have low starting numbers, the percentage difference is really not that useful. It's more useful when you look at numbers that actually have a little bit of size to it. Then you can say, okay, that's significant to go from 92 to 160. This is a significant increase. It doubled, but it already started out at an average larger number. When the beginning number, when the number you're starting with is very small, even a slight increase will translate into a huge percentage number. So that's important to keep in mind that this 450% sounds really huge. And I mean, it is, but really, you went from 2 to 9. In other words, increase of 7 homicides. So, total, it's still not even the same amount of homicides as many of these cities had in terms of even just their increase or even in like 1 month. So, it's important to note that there's the real numbers 2 to 9. And then there's the statistical difference, which is 450%. And that can be very misleading. So, what I did was I took the same data and I basically organized it a little bit better. And then I made charts and graphs out of it to help us visualize it a little bit better. One of the things is you don't really just want to look at a change from one year to the next. You really kind of want to look at the entire, like a trend. You want to get a decent little cross section of it, which is what we basically have here. We have data from 2016 to 2020. So we can look at basically the last 5 years. And so, in order to test this hypothesis of are new people causing the increase in crime, is population growth the thing that is driving new crime? And so, to test this hypothesis that is very commonly held, I decided to take that data and then I can look at it in tables and in charts and compare and test that hypothesis. So these are the two ways that I decided to measure population growth. Residential building permits issued by year, which I got from the city's 2020 RHNA report, and then estimated population by year, which I got from worldpopulationreview.com. The crime statistics have come from the crime statistics report that I just showed you. Now, so let's look at some of this data and let's look at the trend. Okay. Now let's look at total crime. Okay, so this number here, this table, is showing us property crime plus violent crime. And it's just the total for that year, all crime. So what we actually see here, we got 1282, 1219, 1211, 1030, 1149. So there is an increase from 2019 to 2020. But overall, there's actually a decrease from 2016 to 2020, and it was decreasing at a steady rate until 2020. And if we look at this graphed out, what we see here is total crime as a trend was actually going down. 2020 hit and it spiked, but it still was less than where we were 5 years ago. Interesting. And if we look at the side by side with population growth, we see that population is actually growing and crime is actually going down. So it's very interesting because you would look at this and say, actually, there seems to be a correlation that the higher the population gets, somehow crime is going down. Obviously, keep in mind, correlation does not mean causation. So obviously, the population increase is not resulting in a drop in crime. That seems rather silly. But there is a national average, the entire out of the entire US, there is a trend where crime is actually on the decrease in general and has been for the last couple of years. And Los Banos is similar to the United States in that it's reflecting that. Now we take total violent crime. And what we see with total violent crime is that violent crime has been kind of steady, but just barely increasing. Just barely increasing, but kind of holding steady, really. And then a huge spike in 2020. And prior to that, it was increasing, but just ever so slightly. We look at building permits issued. This is the other means of which I could look at a way to test this theory, right? So population growth could mean, people born. It could be other things, right? So a lot of people particularly like to blame the new housing developments and the housing being built, etc. So that's why I like the idea of looking at building permits issued because that measures how many new houses were permitted to be built in that year. And then considering how the market is so fast and they're selling so well, you can pretty much assume that's how many new houses pretty much opened that year. So when we look at this data, right, this graph doesn't really tell us too much other than the fact that not really the same amount of houses are being permitted every year, right? But what we basically see here is that there's really not much of a, there's really no real correlation here. They really don't. Now, some might notice this tick from 2019 to 2020, and then also notice there's an uptick 2019 to 2020 here as well, right? But there's also an uptick in 2018, and we're not really seeing it here. There's also uh, a drop in 2017, and we're not seeing anything here. So the only time we see some kind of correlation is in the year 2020. And so this tells us that there's probably some kind of other rival reason for this. Now let's look at homicide. This one's very interesting. When we graph it out, right, basically these are ones and these are two. So pretty much a homicide rate was really staying constant. It was kind of like every other year it was two and then it was one. So we could kind of say the average homicide rate in Los Banos was about 1.5, right? Because every other year, two people are murdered, and then every year, at least one person's murdered. So it was about 1.5. And then in 2020, it spiked, historical level spike that's hasn't really been seen in a long time. Really kind of unprecedented jump. So if this trend in homicide, right? If this was due to new people moving in, then logically there should be some kind of correlation between permits issued and really with population size. What we should see is as it's been going up, a steady increase in homicide. and we just don't see it. It's actually pretty much flat. And so the real thing that jumps is the year 2020 and the year 2020 alone. It seems to be an anomaly year. And I'm going to get into more on that. And there actually is a great explanation for it. Now, this is property crime versus violent crime. Property crime has actually been consistently dropping. It did uptick a little bit from 2019 to 2020, but overall, it's down actually quite a bit from where it was in 2016. Violent crime is more or less pretty much hold steady, and then it upticked in 2020. So crime has really upticked in last year, just last year alone, but actually prior to that, overall, it was going down. Property crime was dropping, and violent crime was barely increasing, but pretty much staying the same. And this was actually resulting in the overall total crime rate of Los Banos actually declining. So, actually, it's been declining for the last couple of years. So, where does some of this perception that crime is been steadily on the rise over long periods of time? Where does this perception come from? Well, part of it does, I would say, really come from the news because a lot of people like crime news. And so a lot of the local papers, etc., cover a lot of crime news. And this gives the artificial perception that crime is actually more prevalent than it truly is. And seeing an increase in crime coverage over time gives the illusion that crime is going up when the reality is that there just wasn't much news coverage before, and then in the last 2 3 years or so, you've seen my show come into existence. Los Banos Today has come into existence. GV Wire News has come into existence. YourCentralValley.com has come into existence. And so there has been an increase in news media companies that are reporting what's going on better. So it might feel like there was no crime before, and now suddenly there's been an increase in crime, but really it's only been this last year there actually was a decrease in crime. But I think the perception of there being more crime has actually come from more media coverage and just more awareness of local events, but the data actually shows that crime has been going down. Now, here's something that's really interesting, right? So we talked about all these different crimes, and one of the things we noticed was that homicide has really increased more than really any of the other ones. And here's what's fascinating. So I thought to myself, okay, we're looking at Los Banos, right? But in order to really understand what we're talking about, we need to compare this to somewhere else. And so I did just that. What I did was I basically found a couple articles, and there was a massive 1 year rise in homicide rates that bucked trends in 2020 that didn't occur in the other years. And there doesn't seem to be any modern historic precedent. I have another article as well that talks about how this is so unprecedented. And so, what's crazy interesting is that they've looked at the jump, right? And they've gone month by month and they've looked at the various cities. And basically, homicide as a whole has gone up almost 40% across the entire United States. And here we can see some other cities. And what we can see is look here, Fort Worth, Texas went up 64.5% from 2019 to 2020. Minneapolis, 72%. Here's the city that's went up similar to ours, Madison, 400%. Look at this, Aurora, 64%. Omaha, Nebraska, 105%. Chula Vista, 125%. And I can go on and on. But the point is clear. There was a huge increase in murder, specifically murder, in 2020 that bucked all trends up until this point. And what has caused it? Well, the experts say it has to be due to Corona. It has to be due to the lockdown or the pandemic in some way, shape, or form, because that's the only thing that's changed. That's the only thing that can really explain such an anomaly. And it's actually not even just like liberal or conservative news that's saying it. It's really all news. So the last article I just showed you was from NPR, but this was written by someone in Fox News, and it's also stating that the murder rate has no historic precedent, that it's been going up, and that has to do with COVID-19. So, and they're talking about the huge homicide rate jump. So essentially what you have here is both liberal and conservative news in consensus that COVID-19 and the lockdowns has caused a spike in murder rate. This is what the experts are saying. This is what the media is saying. This is basically kind of what everyone's saying. It's not even partisan, surprisingly, because today almost everything seems partisan. Believe it or not, it seems like both Democrats and Republicans can agree on this. The lockdown has caused an increase in homicide. Now, there was one more thing I wanted to show you that was also interesting, just to show you that Los Banos is really not that different from the rest of the United States. So, one of the violent crimes that you see here is rape. And we see that rape has increased over time. Even from 2016 to 2020, it's gone up to 11 to 14. And for the most part, it seems to been increasing. I mean, these 2 years it did decrease, but even in 2019, it increased. It seems to be more or less on the rise. So I looked into that too, and here's what I found. So the FBI crime statistics were showing that violent crime and property crime, if you notice, these graphs actually kind of mirror very similar to what we see with Los Banos, but violent crime has actually been going down over the past several years, and so has property crime. But what's interesting is that even though these crimes have fallen, for the last 6 years since 2018, rape has been increasing. And now this ends at 2018, but this trend has continued through 2019 and 2020. And you might be asking yourself, so why? There's something to keep in mind about the statistics, right? This is data that's reported. There are crimes that occur that will never make it into this data that are not shown here. There are crimes that happen that go unreported, unsolved, undiscovered, and then never make it into the crime statistics. It still is a very accurate measure because it gives us a sense of it's kind of like a sample, but is it complete? Is it wholesome? No, it's not. So, could the uptick in rape actually not truly be an uptick in incidence of rape, but actually an uptick in reporting of rape? Because rape is one of the most unreported crimes there is. And for the longest time, it's been very socially unacceptable to talk about. And for the longest time, it's been something that's really gone unreported. As time has gone on, especially in recent years with like hashtag Me Too movement and some other things, it is becoming more socially acceptable to talk about. And I think what we're actually seeing is that we're seeing an increase in people feeling comfortable to report it. Probably what's the case is that rape has actually gone down over the years, but how comfortable people feel reporting it and education around rape and sexual assault is probably what's actually led to this increase. I think this is an example of something where it's increased more due to the reporting of and maybe not the instances themselves. I can't prove it, but that is something that a lot of the experts also seem to think in some of the articles that I've read. And it definitely makes sense with what I saw and what I've studied in behavioral sciences. So, what does all this mean? What can we do about it? Well, there's a couple things I want to talk about. First of all, crime has actually been going down. So we can stop saying, hey, all these new people are causing increasing more crime because the data just doesn't back that up. The numbers specifically refute that claim. So we can stop blaming new people for the crime. That's one thing. The other thing is we can talk about solutions. Since it seems that this increase in homicide is likely due to COVID and the lockdown, it would also seem pretty logical that it will go away with COVID and the lockdown. So perhaps in this particular instance, there's really nothing to do. Just when the lockdown ends, we should stop seeing this huge uptick in homicide. Now, we've talked about things like increasing infrastructure for police, getting more police on the ground, etc. And that does help. There is proactive policing, and that really does help. And I've seen it recently with our police department. You've probably noticed I've put out several stories where our local police have stopped somebody as a traffic vehicle stop and then performed a gun arrest or something like that. They probably saved someone's life. So the fact that our police department is being proactive and stopping people essentially before they commit a violent crime is helping. The problem is that you'll never know that they prevented a crime. That's impossible to ever know. But I like to think of all those cases where they stop someone who has a loaded handgun on them or something and arrest that person. They probably saved someone's life. We'll never know, but I think it's pretty safe to say that that person doesn't carry around the gun because it's a souvenir from grandpa. If someone's got a gun with a filed off serial number and they're a convicted felon, etc., there's a chance that they're probably planning on using it. So the proactive policing is a big step forward, and the gang task force, those things seem to be making a tangible difference. And then we have code enforcement, which is allowing our police to focus on other things. But at the end of the day, those are still band aid solutions. So I want to show you something else that I thought was interesting, a statistic about Los Banos. And this is where I really think that we have potential to really make a difference in terms of actually reducing crime. So what I'm showing you here is kind of an idea. It's something that I've kind of thought about, but really this is kind of a long-term solution, a long-term goal. But this isn't a band-aid solution. That's one of the things I like about it. So this is Los Banos educational attainment. Now, this chart breaks it down by sex, purple being female and blue being male. But really, to me, that's pretty irrelevant. I'm just kind of looking at overall percentages here. And one of the things that we find is that a small portion of the population has a college education, about 16%. That's really not so much what alarms me about this data. What really alarms me about this data is look at how many people have not finished high school. You add this up 17.70 and 12.59. And pretty much what you come to is the fact that around 30%, it's a little over that, but 30% roughly of our population has not graduated high school. Now that results in low job prospects, etc. That I think is where maybe we should start talking about how do we deal with some of this crime problem, because there's another thing that's very interesting about Los Banos as well. If you look at a majority of the people who commit the violent crimes in Los Banos and even the property crimes, what you find is two things. One, it's overwhelmingly male. The second thing you'll find is that it's usually pretty young. Some of them are even teenagers, guys in their 20s, low 30s, but hardly anyone over the age of 40. It's usually fairly younger men. So these are people who've probably gone through Los Banos education system, and maybe they didn't graduate high school. I can't really prove it, but I'd almost bet money on it that there's probably a correlation, right? A strong correlation between educational attainment, propensity to commit crime, and really what's kind of driving some of our crime is our low education rate. Here's another area that I think is something that we can talk about in terms of maybe our crime. Look at our poverty rate. Look at how high the percentage of individuals that are unemployed. And then 15% of our employed population falls within the poverty line. If we look at the statistics of poverty and education, we quickly see that the vast majority of those that are in this poverty line are people with less than a high school education. And then here's one last thing to show you as kind of where I think the source or part of the source and contributing factor with our crime is. It's no mystery that usually younger people are more likely to commit crime than older people. And if I look back at the articles I've written, most of the time it's some guy in his 20s. Well, look here. The median age for a male is about 29 years old, almost 30. So we have a lot of younger people living in our city. We also have a lot of children. Look at our child dependency ratio, 61.9. So we have a lot of young people in our city, and it's only actually going to get younger considering the fact that many of the homes being sold are intended for first time home buyers, and also because of there being so many individuals under the age of 18. Soon those will be 18, etc. And so let's start talking about job prospects for people, the likelihood of educational attainment, the possibility of making enough to live here and pay the rent and such. Maybe these are really some of the reasons and factors that are driving the crime, and not because of all the new people moving over the hill. Maybe what it really is the fact that we have an unusually high dropout rate. We do. It's really bad. It's far worse than the national average. Most people, in order to afford to live in Los Banos, have to work outside of Los Banos. And when we see numbers like 15% of people in the poverty line in Los Banos are actually employed, that says that the kind of jobs we have here are just simply not enough, and that we need jobs that pay higher wages. Now, I'm not telling you anything new, but what I am wanting to do is kind of maybe open up your mind a little bit, look at the data, look at the numbers, look at the facts, and let's have a real hard conversation about what we can do about crime. If you really want crime to drop and you really care about the issue, you put your preconceived notions and theories behind you. You look at what the data and the facts tell you, and you proceed from there. I really was surprised to see what I thought, because I thought to myself, as population goes up, crime would go up, but I thought maybe the rate would stay the same. I was actually shocked to see that actually crime was going down as population was going up. It seems that much of our crime is actually from people from here, Los Banos, young, didn't graduate or have low educational attainment and have poor job prospects, and end up pursuing a life of crime in order to try to get by. When I look back at many of the videos I've done, many of the articles I've done, some of these people are so young. Some of them are kids, some of them are juveniles. It was a robbery that was committed recently, two of them, in fact, and they involved juveniles. I mean, we kind of need to wake up and realize, hey, maybe the problem isn't that. Maybe there's something we can do. So let's talk about that. I'd like to start talking about how can we increase our high school graduation rate, huh? How can we increase the average wage in Los Banos? How can we attract more business? How can we give our young people something to do? I think that is going to be a far more fruitful discussion than talking about all those people coming from over the hill, because quite frankly, you're welcome to have that position and opinion, but the data just doesn't support it. And then you've got no facts to back up your claim. I'll probably get a lot of hate for this, but the reality is that we need to hear it. I care about the city, and it's more important to tell you what you need to hear than to tell you what you want to hear. If you haven't already, please like, follow, subscribe to Los Panos Talk. We have Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and of course, lospanostalk.com. You can become a supporter of Los Panos Talk for just $4.99 a month and get all the videos first and ad-free. Plus, you'll be helping support independent journalism here in Los Banos. Once again, my name is Justin Collins, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.